phrase thought leader gets tossed around a lot these days, but with our next speaker, it's not a form of flattery, it's a job title. In fact, he's the global head of thought leadership for one of the world's most respected financial services corporations. And when this guy talks, people listen because he's assembled a global network of academic scholars and practitioners from across insurance and asset management industries. When you combine that with his non-pareil research team, we're about to hear from someone who has the ear of influential CEOs and boards across the globe. So he's here today to talk about tackling biodiversity and the biodiversity crisis. Please welcome Henning Stein, Invesco's global head of thought leadership. Henning?
Yeah, thank you, Lee, for the nice introduction. So I'm going to talk about an issue that I think affects all of us. Crucially, it's an issue we can, I think, help to address, just like aging. Until recently, it was an issue very rarely really associated with entrepreneurship or even business in general. And today, I think it's an issue that's increasingly shaping the decisions of the most innovative, far-sighted companies. And this issue is biodiversity. And right now, I think we can all agree nature is declining at a rate unprecedented in human history. The health of the ecosystem on which all life really depends has never deteriorated so rapidly. And biodiversity is really in crisis. And we all know it falls on humanity to reverse its trajectory. And many people think, the answers lies exclusively in dealing with climate change. Climate change is important, but the picture is far more complex than that. And we are actually facing a collection of highly interconnected threats. And this means we're also facing a collection of highly interconnected opportunities, right, on the positive side. So many that takes a form of really extraordinary business opportunities, I would even say. Some of you know, I spoke yesterday about sustainable cities. And at the start of that talk, I highlighted the growing importance of ESG, so environmental, social, and governance considerations. And I'll quickly do that again now, because ESG is really having an ever greater influence on the thinking of investors we work with, businesses, policymakers, and I would say even society as a whole. And it really helps us focusing on the long term, right? And encourage us as asset managers to strive also for positive, lasting change. ESG, in my view, is basically about really safeguarding the future. It's not just a tick box. It's really looking at how can we improve the life on the planet. And what we see today, tackling biodiversity and the crisis, is really at the heart of this monumental challenge. I'd like to start with a quote from Richard Feynman, as a maverick theoretical physicist who earned a Nobel Prize, in fact, for his work on quantum mechanics. That was more half a century ago. And Feynman devoted his academic life to the mysteries of the subatomic world. So he also felt many of the universe riddles, right, would never be solved. We heard about aging. He once said, nature's imagination far surpasses our own. And I quite like that quote. Evidence, I think, of this truth is all around us today. We see it in all the powerful natural forces really humanity struggles to control. We see it in climate change and other environmental problems, and we see it in COVID-19 and other diseases. So we talk a lot about technological hyperconnectivity with our clients, and I mentioned it in my talk yesterday while discussing smart cities and smart elements of sustainable cities. But nature is really hyperconnectivity's original master, and that's why our planet now stands at risk of various existential threats that are highly interrelated. They include not just climate change, but really deforestation, overpopulation, and even how food is produced. So I liked Ali's take on food, right? Because this really shows what potential lies behind the right food. And each of these is really linked to all the others. For example, all that I just mentioned that contributes really to biodiversity loss. And so the basic message here is that humanity's understanding of nature remains dangerously inadequate, and our relationship with nature is essentially broken, and we have to repair that. So climate change is probably the ultimate, most far-reaching illustration of humanity's contempt for natural world. We have taken, I would say, the environment really for granted, and now we're paying the price. But I would like to spend a couple of minutes discussing another example of this contempt. And it's one that's relatively overlooked, but that also presents an existential threat to the planet and the inhabitants. That's factory farming, or it's sometimes referred to intensive farming. It's a globally adopted farming system, basically, that involves crowding large group of livestock into confined indoor spaces, living beings that are, held in very small stalls and cages. And in my view, that really represents a global scandal, and the suffering we inflict on the animals is really seeking to feed ourselves is a key component in, I think, a totally unsustainable, indefensible status quo. And this model of factory farming has, over the years, been really optimized in all possible ways, right? Minimize cost, maximize profits, right? That was all that counted. And this intensive farming or factory farming has become the norm. So we see the numbers in the UK, 70% of UK farm animals now raised in this system. They live a short life, and all they see is this. And you see in the US, it's 99% of US farm animals live in that system. So we can actually forget about the happy grazing cows we all see in the AdWords. That's just an illusion. And the reality is factory farms are more factory than farm. And when we read news stories about climate change or COVID-19, we rarely see factory farming really mentioned. And yet it's really inextricably connected to both global warming and the pandemic. Factory farming, in fact, has a devastating effect on the environment, and experts have linked it to more than a dozen material risks related to the E of ESG. So that includes air pollution, deforestation. We look at greenhouse gas emissions, soil degradation, antibiotic resistance, and resource scarcity and waste. And it's also a breeding ground for actually highly resistant pathogens that can be passed from animals to humans. So COVID-19 is such a pathogen, and this means the next devastating pandemic could easily come from a slaughterhouse. So that's an illustration of how the nexus of nature and interconnected causality are really posing a systemic problem for us. And let's now look at the positive side and explore how they can help us actually apply systemic solutions. And let's stay focused on food production and the consumption for a little longer. It's a great example of how these existential threats actually compel us to seize opportunities to bring about more positive and lasting change. If you look at the plant-based protein alternatives, so sales are currently skyrocketing all over the place, all over the world. And the global market was worth about 10 billion last year, and it's expected to be 14.5 billion US dollars by 25. So I would love to see that figure at 100 billion or more annually. And one of the reasons for this growth is the damage the pandemic has really done to animal protein supply around the world. And this shows crisis can often be a platform for positive change. Innovation is another major driver, and we are starting to see a potentially massive food tech revolution that's transforming really the art of the possible in terms of what we eat and how it's produced, and we heard about this earlier today. So huge strides have obviously already been made in using plant-based ingredients to really replicate the taste and the appearance of meat. Laboratory-grown meat, sometimes known as clean or cultured meat, is now going even further by creating muscle tissue from stem cell samples. You still get the bad effects of the meat, of course, but it's not coming from the intensive farming. So personally, I love walking in my local supermarket here in Zurich, where I'm based, and I buy my plant-based chicken nuggets. They taste actually better than the real thing at McDonald's these days, and I think that's progress. And that really brings me to a third key dynamic: changing diets and consumer trends. We see that a lot now. And personally, I've gone from pescatarian to vegetarian to then vegan in just a few years. And you see that, younger generations, particularly embracing vegetarianism, veganism. Wouldn't say I'm, certainly not pretend I'm young anymore, but it keeps me young, I think. And so we have, I think, a need for positive, lasting change here, and we have the means of bringing this change about. And we have growing appetite for this as well. So these are clearly preconditions for opportunity and for entrepreneurship. We know a key lesson of the nexus of nature is that negative impacts in one area of the nexus lead to negative impact in others. That's the interconnected nature, the causality, how it works. And so it follows that positive impacts in one area of the nexus should lead to positive impacts in others. And that's what scientific research and experience alike are now telling us. And for example, studies are increasingly argue that adopting this vegan diet I was mentioning earlier is the single most effective way in which a person, not an investor, single consumer, can really help save the planet and the ecosystem. And it beats not only driving, it beats reducing air travel, it beats everything. And let's apply that idea to the mass adaptation of lab-grown cultured meat. In my view, cultured meat is a game changer, really capable of radically transforming the world economy because people are more open to that, less open to the vegan lifestyle that I lead, but very open to get the cultured meat in front of them. And it could free up millions of acres of pasture land for other uses. And it could then resolve all the ethical issues I was referring to with animal welfare. It could also provide global access to low-cost, high-protein diet. And similarly, look at the spread of vertical farming. I think this is a wonderful idea as well. I came across recently. It really means the relocation of production to population centers, increasing yields and ensuring broader sustainability. And one US company specializing in this approach, they're using really cutting edge AI and 5G to then monitor the growing conditions in real time and really constantly optimizing the use of resources. And this saves you 90% of the water you would usually use. And this is ag tech at its best, right? We all talk about fintech, but there's also ag tech, and using state-of-the-art thinking really to satisfy this fundamental need for good, for honest, for really healthy food, while at the same time really helping safeguarding the environment. I think it's also worth noting that the company I was just referring to is based in the Appalachians. And that's really bringing employment and prosperity back to this region that was previously really relying on coal mining. And it shows that I think innovation and disruption don't just destroy jobs. They can also create new things. So we are now seeing this rapid emergence of the new players in the space. We are also seeing an increasing recognition among market incumbents that this is the direction they need to take. So we're engaging with market incumbents because we think it's important not to divest from them, because they are helping bringing this about, right? Because they're adopting this technology, and there's really growing acknowledgement that this nexus of nature and the interconnected causality not only exists, but can also be used as a force for good. In 2019, Science actually published a major analysis. They looked at food shocks, right? That means the sudden loss of food production and their consequences in terms of threats to global sustainability. And the authors concluded that we need really bold food policy and social protection mechanisms to promote sustainability in what they called a more shock-prone, a more interconnected world. And as entrepreneurs, as investors, and as consumers, we can help bring about those policies mechanisms. And we can do that by founding, by financing, and favoring companies that promote or welcome this positive, lasting change. And at this point in time, many food production supply chains are defined by the weakest point, by the weakest link. And they are really resources. They're really problem areas in terms of risk and threats. And we can help make all these connections strong and positive. To do that, we have to think more in terms of this interconnected causality. And we heard holistic thinking before. And I think we have to strengthen this one area of the nexus of nature, or one point of the supply chain. We strengthen all the others as well. And that's how we tackle the biodiversity crisis in the asset management industry. It's how we tackle climate change collectively, overpopulation, other existential threats. The causes are really interconnected, and so are the solutions. And this ties in with a couple of points I made yesterday when we discussed sustainable cities. And let me quickly reiterate those, because I think this obviously applies here, particularly with entrepreneurship in mind. First, the most powerful entrepreneurship today is really aligned with ESG. And ESG, that's really shaping our collective future. And any business that doesn't get it, that they don't recognize it, that isn't going to be around for long, right? And there were some regional tendencies in the past few years that has changed. I think now it's a global phenomenon that ESG really counts. Second, the most powerful entrepreneurship today is also focused on innovation and disruption. There's never been so much pressure to bring about that positive, lasting change. And any business that doesn't recognize that isn't going to be around for long either. I've spoken about how everyone of us needs to become more aware of the nexus of nature and interconnected causality. And that means entrepreneurs, businesses, investors, policymakers, consumers. I would like to round off by taking a slightly closer look at what each of these groups can actually do to tackle the biodiversity crisis and, by extension, the existential threats confronting our world. First, and most importantly, for the purpose of this discussion, I think entrepreneurs have to recognize this is a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. So you hear a lot about crisis, but see really this opportunity and go after that. Not for the first time, the human race here needs to innovate its way out of trouble, right? That's where entrepreneurial thinking can make the difference, and innovation, disruption, I think, hold the key to better collective future. Businesses that have unsustainable policies, unsustainable practices simply need to stop. And in particular, those involved in factory farming, they should acknowledge their position within the nexus of nature and really rethink their business practices, right? Investors need to support innovation and disruption and punish unsustainability. We need to put ESG considerations and the long-term thinking at the center of our decisions. So similarly, policymakers, they obviously have a lot of levers we don't have in the private world, and that's regulation. Right? They should back the shift to plant-based protein and lab-grown meat by really encouraging innovation, and they should also really end misdirected agricultural subsidies. I'm always so mad seeing that it's still done in billions of dollars and euro going into these old-fashioned agricultural sectors, and really promote this issue at a much higher up in the agenda. And finally, I believe consumers need to think more about their own health, how it relates to our planet. Mounting evidence suggests many people's dietary habits have themselves very unsustainable. So we all have a part to play, I think, and it's vital we accept that, because the stakes couldn't be higher. If we don't take action, we may destroy every other species before we finally destroy ourselves. But that's hardly a consolation. So yeah, and on that note, maybe I'd like to thank you for joining me today. I'm signing off, and please also feel free to reach out to me, my email, if you want to discuss opportunities, if you want to learn more about my work. And yeah, thank you for this opportunity to speak here at this wonderful conference today.
Okay, Henning, thank you so much. Some fascinating information, but I guess what worries me the most is that if nature and sustainability hinge on human beings changing lifestyle and behavior, and something as fundamental as how they eat, we could be in trouble.
I would disagree. I mean, I mentioned Zurich, and I see here 15% going into vegetarianism in the last 5 years, right? This is huge. And the proliferation of products is massive. So I always believe there's a tendency of humans in the end, they want to improve themselves, and they want to have unlocking potential, as we learned the other day. So I think this is the way of doing it. And then, of course, regulation that I mentioned is a key part that needs to support that change.
Well, thank you, Henning. We can see why you're a thought leader. You've given us a lot to think about.